مساء الخير وأهلا ومرحبا بكم في حلقة جديدة من برنامج ضيف وقضية. هل صحيح أعزائي المشاهدين أن الشبيبة والشابات العراقيين يكرهون الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية؟ 90% من الأجيال الجديدة التي ولدت في بدايات تسعينيات القرن الماضي من العراقيين يعتبرون أمريكا عدوة. هذا ما خلصت إليه دراسة أجرتها مؤسسة سكوهون بيرلاند الأمريكية، التي أجرت استطلاعا شمل 3250 شخصا من 15 بلدا عربيا تتراوح أعمارهم من 18 إلى 25 عاما. وفيما اعتبر شبيبة دول مجلس التعاون الخليجي الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية دولة صديقة وهامة، اعتبر أغلبية المشاركين من العراقيين أمريكا عدو لدودة. فقط 1% منهم قالوا إن أمريكا صديقة. هؤلاء الشبيبة ولدوا وترعرعوا في أجواء فيها هامش من الحرية وليس تحت الحكم السابق. كيف هو مستقبل العراق؟ هل انتهى العراق ولن يعود كما كان الدولة الأولى من حيث القوة والعلم والمعرفة كما يقول المتشائمون الذين يؤكدون في أحاديثهم الخاصة والعامة إن الدولة العراقية ما هي إلا جثة هامدة تنتظر مراسم الدفن فقط؟ أم أن العراق سيعود أفضل 100 مرة مما كان عليه في السابق، وما جرى ويجري فيه من فوضى ما هو إلا إجراءات تصفية حسابات بين السياسيين الذين سينبذهم الشعب العراقي في وقت ليس ببعيد؟ ضيفي هذا الأسبوع هو البروفيسور الدكتور سعيد خان، المحلل السياسي والأستاذ في التاريخ الإسلامي والمختص في قضايا الشرق الأوسط وسياسات الشرق الأوسط في كلية العلوم السياسية في جامعة وين ستيت في ديترويت. أرحب باسمكم بالدكتور الضيف الكريم سعيد خان الذي هو معي بالاستوديو. أهلا وسهلا فيك. I would like to welcome you, Dr. Khan. Thank you for accepting my invitation to talk to our community members directly and to analyze the issue related to the future of Iraq. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I would like to ask you, Dr. Khan, first. I did not talk in detail about you. If I do, I will maybe need at least 2-3 hours. But I want you to give sort of background information, educational, and your experience, and when did you start teaching at Wayne State University?
Sure. Well, my background is in Near East and Asian Studies, and particularly in history. I started at Wayne State in 2004, and I teach a variety of courses in Near East and Islamic Studies, the areas of history, politics, and culture, looking at the whole span of Middle Eastern history going back to the pre-Islamic period onward to the very contemporary. Courses on political Islamic thought, Islam and modernity, comparative religions, as well as courses on modern Egypt, as well as adjuncting at the University of Detroit Mercy, similarly on Islamic studies over there, as well as in the fall term I co-teach a course at Rochester College, which is a small evangelical college in Rochester Hills, teaching a course on Christian-Muslim dialogue.
Great. Thank you very much. As you know, Dr. Khan, our community at large are confused when it comes to Iraq. There are two or maybe more school of thoughts. When we discuss with so many people in our community about the future of Iraq, some believe 100% that Iraq is done. That's it. It never will return to what it used to be before. There are millions of refugees scattered all over the world and in neighboring countries. Thousands of people get killed, tortured, imprisoned, and Iraq is it's about to be divided sharply among various groups, and that's it. Others believe that Iraq is going to come back. The media is not reporting the positive things that are taking place in Iraq. The civic society in Iraq are conducting on daily basis workshops, seminars, symposium about tolerance, about diversity, and about freedom and democracy. And within maybe a few years, this will result in a beautiful Iraq. Iraq will come back as a very diverse and good society, that it will be maybe the best in the Middle East as far as democracy and freedom. What do you say?
Well, I think the truth is always somewhere in between. We have to remember that Iraq is a very, very old area.
Sure.
Iraq is the home of Sargon and Gilgamesh and Nebuchadnezzar. Iraq was the home of the Abbasid Empire for over 500 years. And we have to also remember that there were so many transformations that Iraq has already undertaken. And for those who think that this is now the signaling of the end of Iraq, well, maybe it is the end of a particular chapter in Iraq's history. And I would imagine that probably in the year 1258, when the Mongols invaded and destroyed Baghdad, burned it to the ground, there were more than a few people who probably felt the same way, that Iraq is done, that it will never come back. And we find that it did. It was a thriving area, particularly when the Khans were ruling there, when Taimur was there, when he was not destroying things. And it also was a thriving part of the Ottoman Empire. Now, speaking of the Ottoman Empire, we're now about 100 years on from World War I, and a lot of the instruments for the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, for example, just turned 100 years old a few days ago. This was the document which carves up the Middle East into the pieces that we see it today. And it was done so strictly for the strategic interests and priorities of the British and the French. Now, as you know, Iraq was once 3 separate provinces of the Ottoman Empire, and these were fused together by the British by the Act of the League of Nations. So when we're looking at Mosul province, Baghdad province, and Basra province, there is, of course, the natural tendency for people to say today, well, essentially Iraq is going back to that model. In fact, there are some who have even called for Iraq to be separated into these 3 provinces again. I'm not sure that that's the wisest move, given that 100 years has passed, which is 4 generations of people, and a lot of things have transformed. People have adapted to the borders of the country. People have adapted in some way, even on a very rudimentary level, of an Iraqi identity. So to go ahead and formally and officially split the country into 3 is perhaps not the best model, but what probably will happen as we move forward is that there's going to be some kind of provincialization of the country. And when we see some of the work that you mentioned that is positive on the ground when it comes to civil society, that is perhaps the greatest hope. There is right now a lot of discontent and even a loss of faith in the political system. As you know, right now, the Iraqi government is almost in a state of political paralysis. Haider al-Abadi is unable to even pass any meaningful reforms within the country. There have been demonstrations, riots, even the storming of the so-called Green Zone by the Shi'i cleric Muqtada al-Sadr.
And the corruption continues.
And the corruption continues. What oftentimes happens then in societies like this is when there is no longer any confidence in the political system, people organically and naturally come together on the civic level to engage with one another. What that needs, though, is 2 things. One, the ability to be left alone without any kind of external forces imposing their will or trying to shift the direction of where that is happening naturally. And the other thing that needs to happen is that there needs to be some courageous people from each of these communities to step forward and say that we need to reject violence, we need to reject division, we need to reject conflict, and come together in a much more humanitarian way.
Without the help of the United States or any other outside
Well,
power.
any kind of external help. I think that, again, the United States is one that has played a very major role, and most of the current polling in Iraq says that almost unanimous disapproval of the United States. The negative rating of the United States, particularly among the generation that has grown up since the fall of Saddam Hussein, is almost entirely negative because they have known nothing but instability, nothing but conflict in Iraq over the last 13 years. At the same time, what we find is that there are several players in the region, all of whom have their interests in seeing Iraq either stable or destabilized. And so whether it is Iran, whether it is the Saudis, whether it is some of the other Gulf countries, everyone is claiming as though they have an interest of Iraq and the Iraqi people involved, but really the reality is that they have their own self-interests at
Is
night.
it true, Dr. Khan, that Iran, mentioning Iran, is the dominant power now in Iraq, and the ultimate decision-making process is in the hand of the Iranian, especially when it comes to foreign policy and the internal also related to oil and what have you?
Well, when it comes to the Baghdad government, I think we can go ahead and presume that out of the various actors that we mentioned, I mean the United States, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, etc., Iran probably has the most influence, relatively speaking. But we also have to understand what is Iran's objective and what are its strategic needs when it comes to Iraq. Before, it seemed as though the primary device that Iran had was to create a firewall to prevent further American influence in Iraq, as well as further Arab involvement when it comes to Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states. That seems to be something which has now been accomplished after many years. But the other issue for Iran, of course, is ISIS or Daesh. And they are looking to create a firewall of Daesh from having an influence that could then impact Iran as well. Now, at the same time, Iran doesn't want to go ahead and overplay their hand and what's called the law of diminishing returns. They don't want to have that happen where an Iraq that is perennially unstable, that is dysfunctional, that only then falls into the hands of organizations like ISIS, Daesh, and also can become vulnerable to other actors coming in. One of the worst things that could happen as far as Iran is concerned is that Iraq is then left to its own devices, and groups like ISIS, groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq become stronger. Because at that point then it's really going to become a very volatile situation, even more so than now. So they have to temper that.
What you're saying, Dr. Khan, is when you talked about the division before of Iraq, ISIS in Mosul there to stay.
Well, right now, ISIS has
and the United States have no intention of really removing. If they want, they can, obviously, but they have no intention of removing or fighting on the ground ISIS in Mosul.
For the United States right now, the resistance to going in militarily is not so much of an ideological thing. It has more to do with fatigue. The idea of deploying American troops in a situation which most analysts will say would be a very long and arduous and costly engagement is something that the current administration is simply not interested in doing. And no administration at the end of its second term, with barely 6 months left in office, wants to then initiate yet another war, and particularly another war in this area. Afghanistan is still in a lot of flux. Iraq and Syria certainly are. And one thing that we can see that has been very emphatic is the apprehension to then go militarily into the situation. At the same time, the Pentagon and other national security voices from the administration have said that ISIS is not gaining any territory. On the same point there have been perhaps some overestimations as to how much territory ISIS has lost. There was a promise or a pledge that was made by the administration that by now most of ISIS's territory would be lost to that organization. it seems as though we have now stagnated at somewhere around 40 to 45% of the total territory in Iraq that ISIS once held. Well, that is, I suppose, some good news that it is now about half of what it used to be. But unless and until Mosul falls, we're really going to still see ISIS as having a major critical mass of territory and resources from which it can draw. I know as of late that there are efforts underway to take ISIS or take Mosul back from ISIS. But again, this is going to be a very, very complicated issue given how embedded ISIS is with the local population. The local population in Mosul is certainly not thrilled with ISIS being there, but it's going to be very, very difficult to be able to separate the civilian population from the militants.
According to go back to the future of Iraq, and you mentioned the youth, I said in Arabic in my introduction that 94% of the youth age 18 to 25 who were born after the fact, after the invasion of Iraq by the United States, they hate the United States of America. If the United States continue to have interest under the new, next year, the new administration, do you think the United States will do anything to repair that really huge, to have a new 94% of the new generation hate the United States? That will, negatively impact the relation between the United States and Iraq.
Of course.
What would be the action that the United States administration will take?
Well, the actions that it most likely will take is still trying to demonstrate that it ultimately did something that was beneficial for the Iraqi people.
Okay.
And I think that that's an unwise narrative to use. At this point, no one's interested in saying that we got rid of Saddam Hussein and we restored democracy. There is one level of importance even beyond democracy for most people in the world, and that is stability. And unless and until the United States could deliver on a measure of stability, I'm afraid that those numbers of antipathy toward the United States are going to remain. Remember that this is an age group between 18 and 25 which is upset because their entire social system has been destroyed. Their economic future is destroyed. With all of the unstable conditions, employment is a big issue. And there is no ability for the United States to necessarily be able to establish or reestablish those institutions which will provide these things. The hope for the Iraqi people may come from the Chinese, because China has a different model of investment. And we find that where China has gone in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere in the world, they don't bring about the same kind of baggage that the United States or the Europeans do, particularly when it comes to the Middle East. China is not the British, China is not the French, and China is not the United States. Three countries which the public perception in Iraq, as well as many other places in the Middle East, is very, very negative. China does not try to assert cultural imperialism. They're not going to, for example, demand that people in Iraq eat with chopsticks. They're not going to demand that they bring about a certain kind of political model that was insisted by the United States when the CPA went in after Saddam fell with Paul Bremer. I mean, that was a disastrous situation because when the Iraqi constitution was also drafted, there were not any kinds of safeguards for religious and ethnic minorities. It was just a simple majority rules, and when the Shi'i population came into power, particularly with Nouri al-Maliki, it brought with it, unfortunately, a vendetta in order to settle scores. China has a different model. For them, it's all about investment, and it's all about return on investment. So if they start to come in beyond just the petroleum industry, which of course is very important to China because of its energy needs, but if they can also start to establish gainful employment for the Iraqi people. One of the facts that you know very well is that before the war, Iraq was one of the most highly educated countries in the region. if it can restore that aspect or that element of civil society, given that the country has already inherently the ethos for being educated, and the ethos for being employed and for working in an industrious way, then perhaps we can move the needle on Iraq.
Before the end of this year, I believe Iraq will elect a new president.
Yes.
Do you think the new president must be with his outlook or her outlook with the Chinese policy and politics, or does not matter?
Well, remember, there's two different issues that are going on in Iraq. There's always the domestic, and then there's the foreign policy aspect, and they are completely related. One of the things that Haider al-Abadi has provided is resistance to the United States.
Okay.
I think one thing that is clear is that there is a very lukewarm relationship. Abadi is not seen as a puppet by any means to Washington.
Or Iran, for that
or
matter.
Iran, I think, and that's a very good point. So he is seen as his own man. Unfortunately, on the domestic front, though, his parliament is in shambles. They will not allow him to advance. He comes into power in 2014 because Nouri al-Maliki was forced to step down. But Maliki's Dawa party is one of the major obstacles within the parliament in order to allow Abadi to bring about the kinds of reforms, removing many of the current ministers and bringing in technocrats into the parliament, into the ministries. All of these efforts to block them is creating a kind of paralysis in the country, which is then leading to the kinds of demonstrations and the backlash that we're finding among the people. If there is the prospect of elections which can have people really make a difference instead of maintaining the status quo of corruption, then there's some kind of guarded optimism. But as things stand right now in Iraq, there really doesn't appear to be that prospect.
Wow. And the American role, what would it be under, let's say, President Donald Trump or President Hillary Clinton?
Well, and this is only going by their stated remarks. For Trump, it's an interesting situation because there's a major inconsistency. On the one hand, he wants to go in militarily and defeat ISIS. And at the same time, he also says that he wants to be isolationist, that America should not be the police person of the world. I don't know how one can go ahead and reconcile those two things. I would suspect that just by his very nature, he would want to engage militarily in Iraq in order to try to neutralize ISIS. I think that's a foolish decision to make, because it shows something that is quite reckless. And it was the military intervention which has led to so much of the malaise in Iraq already. Hillary Clinton, though, at the same time should not be discounted or dismissed as being the exact opposite of Trump. In fact, she's quite hawkish, much more so than the current president. One of the major areas of difference between her and President Obama is, of course, the fact that she voted to authorize military invasion of Iraq, whereas Obama opposed that. At the same time, she's also made many overtures that military strikes should not be off the table, and particularly when it comes to what she then might feel as a way to ultimately reduce the American footprint in the region. She may similarly call for some kind of military strikes. The problem is if they look to do so in a gradual buildup, because we've seen models of that happen in the past, perhaps most notably with Vietnam. It started with a few advisors that became a few more advisors to then have some small military intervention, which then became a full-blown engagement and conflict, which led to the loss of 58,000 American lives and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese lives in the process.
How important Iraqi oil to the United States with this very sophisticated technology and lack of dependence maybe the next 5 or 6 years or 10 years on oil from the Middle East?
Right. Well, America has never really been that dependent on Iraqi oil in particular. It's important to know that over 80% of America's oil usage comes from outside the Gulf. It's,
But they
it's
depend. They receive, I believe, 336,000 barrel every day from Iraq.
right, but that's
Yeah,
also that's a
it's
drop.
nothing.
That's a drop in the bucket, as they say. By far, the largest oil imports come from Canada and from Mexico, and it's again, what we find is that this is one of the illusions that is perpetuated in order to say that this area is still strategically important. It's quite a contradiction.
Really?
That on the one hand, our oil dependency from the region is relatively low, but yet in order to assert our rationale for being there, we have to then claim that this area is important. At the same time, we do have to remember that while for the United States it may not be a major locus of oil import, it is for other countries
But
that
still,
are highly
Iraq
energy
is the second largest oil producer
Yes.
in the world
Yes.
after Saudi Arabia.
Yes, and in fact, what we find that the amount of oil production has increased in Iraq. But one of the problems is that despite the fact that oil is being produced at a higher level in Iraq, its ability to ship the oil has been severely compromised because either ISIS is controlling refineries or ISIS is controlling pipelines, particularly the access to the northern pipeline through Turkey.
So what you're saying is that this is against the general, the belief that the United States is always involved in the Middle East, especially in Iraq, motivated by oil. This is a false belief, right?
Well,
it was not.
There's two aspects about the oil industry. One is to have oil come from the Middle East for American consumption. And the other is for American companies to be in the region to control production and prices for the global market. So it's important to go ahead and parse this fact. The region still bears strategic importance because it's a matter of American companies being in there to profit from it, as well as to go ahead and keep other companies out.
And the American policy ultimately is not determined by the American companies.
I would say actually that it is the American companies that drive an awful lot of American foreign policy.
Really?
Yes, and I think that it's not just in the oil sector. I think we also have to consider, for example, one of America's other big exports, which is military equipment. And so it's important to see that what then is the role of defense contractors in lobbying administrations for certain foreign policy. Case in point, despite the fact that last summer the Obama administration inked the deal with Iran to keep nuclear weapons off the table, at the same time, over the last several months, it has engaged in multi-billion-dollar arms sales to Saudi Arabia, to the United Arab Emirates, and now another impending sale to Israel of arms. Why it would seem as though if the specter of nuclear proliferation is off the table, there's the need to increase the sale of conventional weapons. These things seem to be paradoxical to one another, but you also realize that there's this kind of fear factor. At the same time that the United States says to these countries in the region, you have nothing to fear because there is no more specter of a nuclear Iran, here let's at least sell you some more weapons because you might need them for some other reason.
How do you see, Dr. Khan, the total picture of the Middle East systems as it exists now in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Iran, for that matter? I mean, the next 5 years, is it going to be different than what we're seeing now, or maybe 2 months from now it will drastically change?
And it could be either one or both. What we have to remember, and going full circle back to the fact that the Middle East, as we understand it today, was carved up, drafted, and shaped in the aftermath of World War I. All of these countries didn't exist 100 years ago. And so what we find then is that as these boundaries and these borders were drawn on the ground, and as these countries develop sovereignty, and as they develop certain relationships, not only with one another, but also with these external forces that put them in that position, we're now seeing the legacy 1 century later of what this has all meant. It is still a work in progress. And we have so many complex and complicated relationships. On the one hand, we have still one of the overarching issues in the region, which is this Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The Arab Wahhabi Sunni monarchy, which is in many ways the satellite or the mothership to all these satellites in the Gulf. And then on the other side, we have Persian, Shi'i, pseudo-democratic Iran. And there is a major clash for ultimate control over the region.
And they will continue to be highly opposed to each other because
unless
religious
there's some mediation, yes. And there was hope that with the inking of this nuclear deal with Iran, that the United States could in fact then come back into a role that it hasn't had in the last 37 years, becoming a force to provide some kind of a bilateral engagement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Remember, before 1979, and before the severance of diplomatic relations with Iran, the United States regarded Saudi Arabia and Iran to be its twin pillars of foreign policy in the region. For the last 37 years, Saudi
during
Arabia...
the Shah regime, you mean?
That's correct.
About, yeah.
For the last 37 years, though, Saudi Arabia has benefited exclusively from having the only voice in the region to which the United States will listen. So they have had the monopoly when it comes to the relationship between those two countries. That is something which, of course, has deeply affected the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. On top of that, we now have a very young and seemingly impetuous deputy crown prince, but by all accounts is the one who is really running the show in Riyadh, Mohammed bin Salman, the king's own son, who is also the defense minister. He is in charge of the what's called really the royal court. He's also in charge of the economics and development ministry. So he's a man with many portfolios, but he is also the architect of some significant conflict. After all, he's the architect of the war in Yemen as well. So we don't know in the next 5 years, for example, with a king who suffers apparently from dementia and is already very elderly, what the future holds for Saudi Arabia. And that is by far the most interesting and dangerous question in the region. If there is some kind of a thawing of the relationship, or at least a détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia, then several of the other issues in neighboring countries, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, the tensions can be alleviated there.
And whatever happened between Saudi Arabia, whether they will accomplish peace or war will take place between them, will determine the fate of other small countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and maybe the Gulf state. Jordan in particular, they are very efficient, they have very limited resources. The king is very active, proactive. He's touring the whole world in order to provide for his people. Is it up to Israel to keep Jordan intact as is, or the international community will interfere if something happened to Jordan, if Israel decided to overthrow the king or to change the formula in Jordan?
It wouldn't be in Israel's interest to move things around in Jordan. They have a very good relationship with King Abdullah, as they had with his father, King Hussein, since the peace treaty was signed in the middle of the 1990s. Israel is always considering how precarious its borders are. It feels a certain level of confidence with Sisi in power in Egypt. It behooves it to have good relations with King Abdullah. The monarchy right now is stable. In fact, if anything, it would be perhaps something to see Israel trying to maintain or stabilize the monarchy of Jordan in case the public becomes restive. And there's always that potential of Jordan becoming wobbly, because not that there is any kind of internal issues, but because it is facing the influx of the refugees from Syria, which is going to have a major impact on its economic viability. Similarly, if there is a spillover of the ISIS conflict into Jordan from either Syria or Iraq, that is going to be seen as highly problematic as well.
But the millions of refugees from Syria, Iraq, and from Yemen, also ultimately they will be integrated into the Jordanian culture and way of life, and they will be issued a passport, just like the Palestinian who left Palestine in 48 and 67.
But remember, even when it came to the Palestinians, particularly after 67, that was not a very smooth process. When the Palestinians came in 1967, which was this major influx, they were still considered to be in limbo vis-a-vis their status. And even to this day, there is a de facto level of distinction. People will ask in Amman, are you Jordanian or Palestinian?
This is a common question.
This is a very common question, and it's not just one about identity. It's about national inclusion. And in 1970, of course, there was the Black September movement where there was a lot of unrest when it came to the Palestinian population, which then had to be clamped down rather brutally by then King Hussein. We also have to remember that that was certainly not the only refugee crisis for Jordan. There was, of course, the absorption of refugees in the early 2000s with the Iraq War, where a lot of money, there was some that came in 1990 as well. So essentially what we have now is at least the third or the fourth incarnation of refugees coming in. And as you had said quite rightly, Jordan is a country that has very few natural resources, and it also has very few sources of really foreign exchange and income. One of its biggest assets, of course, are its people, highly educated, many of whom work in the Gulf states as teachers or engineers. But we also then have to consider that with the price of oil dropping as much as it is, albeit by the Saudis trying to manipulate the price of oil, that's going to have a major impact. If these economies throughout the Gulf start to feel a shudder, where they're going to be starting to cut back on some of the public utilities and benefits that they give quite freely to their peoples. In the case of Saudi Arabia, free education, free electricity, free gas, etc. Then one of the other areas that it's going to have to cut back on is employing foreign workers. When we think of foreign workers in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, we think of generally Bangladeshis, Indians, Pakistanis building some of the construction projects. But we're also talking about a major infrastructure, Jordanian, Egyptian, Palestinian, who are in the fields of education, healthcare, and engineering. If those jobs start getting cut in order to then hire local nationals, Saudis, Qataris, Emiratis, etc., coming back to Jordan, where there already aren't those jobs, that reabsorption is going to be a very, very tricky process.
And I hope that, do you think that the Saudi will end up refugee in Jordan someday?
Wow. Well, I mean, interestingly enough, Jordan and Iraq both had kings who were from the Hijaz. It was the family of Sharif Hussein who led the Arab revolt against the Ottomans, who then had his sons, Abdullah in Transjordan and Faisal in Iraq, be the first two monarchs and establish the Hashemi dynasties there.
Do you think history will repeat itself? There are so much talk now inside Jordan and here within our community that the Hashemite is coming back to part of Iraq and Syria, part of Syria and Jordan as we know it now.
Well, I mean, historians will always say that history doesn't repeat itself, but there's an awful lot of things that seem similar.
I would like to thank you very much, Dr. Khan, for being with us. Time is running out. I enjoyed and I learned a lot from you this afternoon. I really appreciate you coming to the studio.
Well, thank you.
Hopefully we'll call you again and again to become a part of our team here to educate the maximum number of our community members. Thank you.
I'll be honored. Thank you.
أعزائي المشاهدين، شكرا لإصغائكم ومتابعتكم، وحتى نلتقي في الأسبوع القادم في حلقة جديدة من برنامج ضيف وقضية. لكم مني ومن أسرة البرنامج أجمل تحية والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.